was Jesus Christ? A question that ignites the imagination, that tears apart routine and stirs the deepest recesses of the heart. But this video will not provide a simple answer, because the answer does not lie in cold logic, but in the burning passion of believing in something greater. Science lives in doubt, demands proof, scrutinizes every detail. Faith, on the other hand, is pure fire. It surrenders, ignites, and transforms without hesitation. And Jesus, he understood, like no one else, the secret desires and conflicts of the soul. He knew that every human being yearns for a purpose, for belonging, for security. But he also knew that we are driven by intense impulses, deep fears, and the insatiable hunger for something beyond the visible. The faith that he preached was not a set of cold rules. It was an emotional revolution, a cry for freedom that awakened and set the spirit on fire. It was an energy that transformed, that liberated, and that left indelible marks on the heart. But be careful. Jesus never preached a faith without intelligence. He challenged, provoked, questioned. He broke the invisible chains that imprisoned minds, freeing them from rigidity and fear. The greatest prison is not made of stone, but of limiting ideas and blind beliefs. And Jesus? He shattered them with powerful questions, opening windows to a new way of thinking and feeling. So who was he? A wise man, a visionary, or the Son of God himself? How could he foresee the future, anticipate Judas's betrayal, Peter's denial? How could he feed multitudes with so little, performing miracles that defied any rational explanation? Can science explain it? No, because science does not have the power to decipher what burns and pulses in the soul. Christ remains a fascinating mystery, an enigma that captivates and challenges, a symbol that divides opinions, but that never ceases to have a profound impact. His message is an irresistible call that echoes through the centuries, touching billions, setting hearts ablaze and awakening intense emotions. In the end, perhaps this is what humanity desires most, something that cannot be explained. It can only be felt intensely.
Who was Jesus Christ? This video, which aims to perform a psychological analysis of the intelligence of Christ, cannot answer such a question. It enters the sphere of faith, a sphere that goes beyond the limits of scientific investigation, that transcends the science of interpretation. Science is silent when faith begins. Faith transcends logic. It is a conviction in which the absence of doubt. Science survives on doubt. The greater the doubt, the greater the dimension of the answer can be. Without the art of doubt, science cannot survive and expand its production of knowledge. Christ spoke about faith. He spoke of the need to grow without doubting, of a complete belief without insecurity. He spoke of faith as a mysterious process of internalization, as a clandestine life trajectory, about faith as a way of living that transcends the material world, that goes beyond the sensory system, and that takes root in the depths of the human spirit. Science cannot investigate what this faith is, because it has roots in the core of personal experience. Therefore, it does not become an object of investigable study. However, despite Christ speaking of faith as a process of transcendental existence, he did not nullify the art of thinking. On the contrary, they were exceptional masters in this art. Christ did not argue about a faith without intelligence for him. First, one should exercise the ability to think and reflect before believing. Then he came to the crescendo. If we study the four Gospels and investigate the way Christ reacted and expressed his thoughts, we will see that thinking with freedom and conscience was a masterpiece for him. One of the biggest problems faced by Christ was the intellectual prison in which people lived. In other words, the intellectual rigidity with which they sought and understood themselves. That is why, despite speaking of faith as the absence of doubt, he was also a sophisticated master. In the use of the art of doubt, he used it to open the windows of the intelligence of the people around him, like Christ used the art of doubt. if we observe the texts of the four Gospels, we will see that he was an excellent questioner, a bold questioner. He used the art of questioning to lead people, thus internalizing the thoughts of all his listeners. Who is Christ? He is the Son of God. He has a divine nature. He is the author of existence. How he anticipated time and foresaw events that had not yet happened, such as the betrayal of Judas and the denial of Peter. How he performed supernatural acts that left people ecstatic. How he multiplied a few loaves and fish, the hunger of thousands of people. He multiplied matter molecules or any other phenomenon. Science cannot give these answers about Christ or many others because these questions, as I said, when faith begins, which is intimate and personal to each human being, and which therefore must be respected, science is silent. Christ will continue in many areas, a great enigma for science, if science dares to enter a sphere that excludes phenomena capable of investigation. It will easily enter the terrain of a discourse. However, one thing does not cancel out. The other science does not cancel out the human spirit, the intimate experience. Perhaps one day science, faced with its limits, will come to completion with phenomena that go beyond the limits of classical logic. However, this is a very complex subject, and coherent arguments easily emerge. These texts do not deal with this subject, but with the areas that can be investigated by Christ. It is not possible to comment on Christ's intelligence in a few chapters. His art of thinking is too sophisticated to be addressed in just one book. Other works will be necessary to address this when we investigate his intelligence. Perhaps we can answer some of these important questions. Christ always expressed his intelligence with elegance and coherence in various situations. He would have divided the history of humanity if he had not performed any supernatural act, because his words remain alive to this day, stirring hundreds of millions of people of all languages and all social, economic, and cultural levels. Because men who had never heard him and never touched him have said, amazingly, throughout history, that they not only believed in him but also loved him, among whom are included several thinkers, philosophers, and scientists. In these texts, we will take an interesting intellectual journey as we investigate the life of Christ. Contrary to what one might think he liked to be investigated. Christ enjoyed being analyzed, intelligently questioned. He was critical of the people who investigated him. Superficially, on one occasion, he even provoked the scribes and Pharisees to study more deeply about the identity of the origin of Christ. The four biographies of Christ. He was a real or imaginary character. Christ has four biographies that are called Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew, of Mark, of Luke, and John Mark. And Luke were not among the 12 disciples. They wrote about Christ based on a process of investigation of people who lived closely with him. The biographies of Christ are not biographies in the classical sense. However, as the Gospels portray his story, we can say that they represent his biography. Every scientist is an inveterate inquirer, an adventurer on the paths of the unknown, and a questioner of everything. The kind to investigate with criteria what one sees and hears is to respect oneself and one's own intelligence. If one does not respect one's own intelligence, one cannot respect what you believe in. We should not accept anything without first carrying out a critical analysis of the phenomena we have observed for many years. I have tried to study the biographies of Christ on several occasions. I have asked myself if Christ had really existed. I have questioned whether he had not been a literary invention, fruit of the human imagination. This is a fundamental question, and we should not be afraid to investigate there before we study this point. Let me tell you a little about atheism. Those who call themselves atheists have as their favorite subjects talking about God, or the idea of denying his existence, every human being, no matter who they are, whether or not they like to have God on the agenda of their most important ideas. Most atheists really did not believe in God. No, most atheists' foundations, their atheism was the result of indignation against the injustices, inconsistencies, and socio-political discriminations committed by the reigning religiosity at a certain time, when everyone thought that the sharp thinker of the French, Enlightenment, was an atheist, he proclaimed, "In end of his life I die, worshiping God, loving my friends, not hating my enemies, but hating superstition." Most atheists had and have a social atheism based on anti-religiosity and not on the production of intelligent knowledge uncontaminated by intellectual distortions of atheistic passions and psychosocial tendencies about the existence or not of God. I was probably more of an atheist than many of those who considered themselves great atheists, such as Karl Marx. That is why I researched the intelligence of Christ, continually asking whether he was the fruit of human imagination, literary creativity, or if he had really existed. As a researcher of intelligence, I investigated within the field of my specialty, that is, within the field of the construction of the thoughts described in the 4 biographies of Christ. I researched the logic, limits, and scope of his intelligence. Many copies belong to a date close to the originals, approximately 75 fragments dated from 135 AD to the 8th century. All this data, added to the intellectual work produced by scholars of paleography, archaeology, and textual criticism, assure us that we have a reliable text of the New Testament that contains the 4 biographies of Christ. The 4 Gospels, the archaeological and paleographic foundations, can be useful in giving us a reliable text, but they do not analyze the text itself, so they are insufficient to resolve the doubt as to whether Christ was real or the fruit of human intellectual creativity. They are limited to providing data for a broad psychological analysis of Christ's thoughts and the intentions of the original authors of the Gospels. To analyze these texts, it is necessary to penetrate the 4 biographies of Christ and to research even what was between the lines of these texts, as well as the various levels of intellectual coherence contained in them, such as the conscious and unconscious intentions of the authors of the 4 Gospels. I used several versions for this purpose. I also tried to research each idea, each reaction, each moment of silence, and each thought that Christ produced in the various situations that he experienced, especially in his centers of tension. I needed to know if I was analyzing the intelligence of a real or imaginary person. The result of this investigation is very important. My research could lead me to 3 paths: to remain in doubt, to convince myself that Christ was the most spectacular fruit of the human imagination, or to convince myself that he really existed, that he was in fact a real person who walked this earth. I came to a conclusion that I will demonstrate and defend in the next texts the conscious and unconscious intentions of the authors of the Gospels. If we study the conscious and unconscious intentions of the authors of the Gospels, we will see that they did not intend to found a philosophy of life, to promote a political hero, to build a religious leader before whom the world should bow. They just wanted to write about an ordinary person who completely changed their lives. They wanted to record facts, even if incomprehensible and strange to the readers, that Christ lived, spoke, and expressed. If we study the intricacies of the thoughts described in the Gospels, we will see that there are several factors that show that Christ had an unusual and distinct personality. 2 of the authors of the Gospels were close disciples of Christ, Matthew and John, the Gospel of Mark. It was probably written based on the accounts of Peter. Mark was so close to Peter that he was considered a son to him. So we conclude that 3 of these authors had a close relationship with the character Christ. Was Christ real or a product of the imagination? If the Gospels were the fruit of the literary imagination of these authors, they would not speak ill of themselves. They would not comment on the fragile and humiliating attitude they had when they dispersed when Christ surrendered to his opponents and left his eloquence and his supernatural acts aside. The disciples were fragile and confused at that moment. They were ashamed of him and felt fear in that situation. Peter swore that he would not deny Christ. He loved this master so much that he said that if possible, he would die with him. However, Peter, in a delicate situation, denied him, and not just once, but 3 times, and even before people without any political power. Who told the authors of the 4 Gospels that Peter denied Christ 3 times? Who told some servants about his humiliating attitude? If no one in his circle of friends, Peter himself had the courage to tell him. Which author would speak ill of himself? Peter not only told the facts, but also the details of his denial to Luke. He told some details that we will study. Who will? Peter, who when young was a rude in a fisherman's cult, learned to be so sincere, so honest with himself, to the point of talking about his own miseries. He must have learned from someone who at least greatly admired someone who had such complex characteristics in his intelligence that he was capable of teaching Peter to deeply internalize his existential values. The Christ described in the Gospels had such characteristics. Christ, even when faced with tense situations, Peter learned from Christ the art of being faithful to one's own conscience is difficult, to assume one's mistakes and weaknesses, which indicates that this Christ was not a literary character but a real person. If the authors of the Gospels wanted to consciously produce a religious hero, they, like his disciples, would not have felt ashamed of him in the moments before he died, because that should have been against the adhesion to this fright. This fact represents an unconscious phenomenon that accuses the intention of the disciples of writing an ordinary man who really lived on this earth. When Christ was imprisoned, insulted and beaten, the young John abandoned him and fled desperately, along with the others. Disciples in addition, John, the author of the 4th Gospel himself, described with courage his fragility and impotence in the face of the dramatic physical and psychological pain of his master on the cross when he was old. About 90 years after Christ, more than half a century after this event occurred, all the apostles had probably already died. At that time, some were abandoning the basic lines of Christ's teaching. So John, in his old age, described everything he had seen and heard. What is expected of a very old person who is at the end of his life? That he no longer has any need to pretend, omit, or lie about the facts he saw and lived. Old John did not hide behind his words. He not only spoke about a person, Christ, who had a profound impact on his life story, but in his description, he also did not forget to address his own fragility. This is unusual in literature. It only makes sense for an author to expose his flaws in this way if he wishes to portray the real biography of a character who is above them. Man understands how to hide his weaknesses and mistakes, but Christ's biographers learned to be faithful to their conscience. They learned from Christ the art of distilling wisdom from errors. When studying Christ's biographies, we found that the conscious and unconscious intention of their authors was only to faithfully express what they had experienced, even if it were completely extracted from human concepts. If Christ were the fruit of the imagination of his biographers, they would not only have erased the dramatic moments of excitement they had, but they would also have erased from their writings the dramatic anguish that Christ himself went through on the night he was betrayed in Gethsemane. One day, perhaps, I will write about this psychological moment, the experiences involved in this environment, and it will be synthetic that night. Christ expressed the dimension of the chalice he would drink, the physical and psychological pain he would endure. If the authors of the Gospels had planned the creation of a character, they would have hidden Christ's pain, his suffering, and the content of his words. They would have only commented on his moments of glory, his miracles, his popularity. The description of Christ's pain is evidence that he was not a literary creation. He did not live a play. What he did, lived, was reported. They would not have silenced Christ either. When he was before the judgment of the chief priests and politicians, on the contrary, they would have put brilliant answers in his mouth. Christ spoke wise and eloquent words that left even the most rigid people speechless. However, when Pilate was intrigued, at the moment when Christ most needed arguments, he preferred to remain silent. With his intelligence, he could have escaped the judgment. However, he knew that the judgment was partial and unfair. He is one of those people, and at no time did he try to defend himself from what he had done and said in public. Christ simply surrendered himself to his opponents and let them play with his words and behavior. He was judged humiliated and died unjustly, and his biographers wrote this: Christ could not have been the fruit of the intellectual creativity of some author. On the one hand, there are many psychological facts that clearly demonstrate that the authors of the Gospels did not have the conscious and unconscious intention of creating a character like Christ in literature. On the other hand, we need to investigate whether the human mind has the capacity to create a personality like Heathcliff's. See, Christ did not behave like a hero or an anti-hero. His intelligence was unique. His behaviors deviated from the standards of the human intellect when everyone expected him to speak. He remained silent when everyone expected him to take advantage of the supernatural acts he performed. He asked that the people, he helped not tell anyone what he had done. He avoided any kind of ostentation, what also could. Imagine a character as intriguing as this one on the night he was betrayed. He facilitated his arrest because he took with him only 3 of his disciples. He did not want the crowd that always accompanied him to be present at that moment. Even with the presence of some disciples, there was already some aggression in that situation because Peter injured one of the soldiers. He did not want to spill blood or cause any kind of violence. He was concerned both with the safety of the people who followed him and with that of his opponents. Those who arrested 5'8" is unusual and very strange for a person to be concerned with the well-being of his opponents. He predicted his death several times and facilitated his arrest. The world bowed at his feet, not because of the intelligence of the authors of the 4 Gospels, because they do not intend to produce a text with great literary style. The world recognized him because his thoughts and attitudes were so eloquent that they spoke for themselves. They did not need literary arrangements from his biographies. What draws attention in the biographies of Christ are his unusual behaviors, his gestures that go beyond concepts, his ability to consider the pain of each human being. Even in the face of his own pain, we will study that his ideas were so surprising that they have no historical precedent. Even his moments of silence had a great meaning. I believe that several passages expressed in his 4 biographies have so many intellectual secrets that many were not understood, even by their own authors at the time. They wrote them. Christ's reactions really contradict our concepts, stereotypes, and paradigms. Let us see his triumphal entry into Jerusalem after having traveled for a long period, the entire region of Galilee countless. Now the time had come to enter Jerusalem for the second and last time, the great religious and political center of Israel. At that time, Christ was at the height of his popularity. The people were euphoric and proclaimed him as King of Israel. Some disciples, who at that time were not yet aware of his desire, even disputed who would be greater if he conquered the political throne. 7 the disciples and the crowds were ecstatic. However, once again, he had an unpredictable attitude that shocked everyone when everyone expected him to enter. Jerusalem with a large entourage and pomp, he took an eloquent and clear attitude that demonstrated that he rejected any type of political power with the outside country. He sent some of his disciples to take a small animal, a donkey, and had the courage to mount that clumsy animal. And that was how that highly admired man entered Jerusalem. Nothing is more satirical and disproportionate than the swing of a man. Carried by a donkey, the animal is strong but is small. It has a mount, doesn't know where to put his feet. If he lifts them, he dares to drag them along the floor.
Understanding the mind of Christ. In-depth analysis inspired by the work of Augusto Cury discover in this video the impressive psychological journey of Jesus Christ based on the renowned work The Master of Masters by Dr. Augusto Cury. Let's dive into a deep reflection on how Jesus used emotional intelligence, the art of doubt, and the power of faith to impact the world. This video is a narrative tribute based on the analysis of the Intelligence of Christ collection and aims to inspire, move, and expand your vision on spirituality, mind, and humanity. Jesus didn't just preach, he touched minds, freed hearts, and taught the value of thinking deeply. Full credits. All content is inspired by the work of Dr. Augusto Cury. Acquire the books in the collection for a transformative and enriching reading. If you are looking for spiritual growth, emotional intelligence, understanding the human mind through the figure of Jesus, understanding the mind of Christ, in-depth analysis inspired by the work of Augusto Cury. Discover in this video the impressive psychological journey of Jesus Christ, based on the renowned work The Master of Masters by Dr. Augusto Cury. Let's dive into a deep reflection on how Jesus used emotional intelligence, the art of doubt, and the power of faith to impact the world. This video is a narrative tribute based on the analysis of the Intelligence of Christ collection and aims to inspire, move, and expand your vision on spirituality, mind, and humanity. Jesus didn't just preach, he touched minds, freed hearts, and taught the value of thinking deeply. Full credits. All content is inspired by the work of Dr. Augusto Cury. Acquire the books in the collection for a transformative and enriching reading. If you are looking for spiritual growth, emotional intelligence, understanding the human mind through the figure of Jesus, this video is for you. Subscribe, like, comment, and share to help this message reach those who need it. Christ was the greatest expert on human emotions. With him, even silence spoke. Augusto Cury, this video is for you. Subscribe, like, comment, and share to help this message reach those who need it. Christ was the greatest expert on human emotions. With him, even silence spoke. Augusto Cury,